I spent 3 full years buried alive in a steel box, 50 feet under the Nevada dirt. I had no sunlight, no phone, no internet, and no contact with the outside world. The only thing I had to keep me company was a photograph of my wife and my stepson. They were smiling in the picture. It was a beautiful photo. It was also the last thing I saw before they locked the heavy steel door from the outside, poured concrete over the escape hatch, and left me down there to rot. They say hell is full of fire, but they are wrong. Hell is cold. Hell is a concrete room where the only sound is your own breathing. Let me tell you how a man ends up buried in his own grave by the people he loved the most, and how he claws his way back out to make them pay. My name is Thomas. I am a simple man. I never liked big words, fancy clothes, or going to fancy parties. I grew up working with my hands. By the time I was 40, I had a good construction business. We built strong houses, the kind that last for 100 years. I made good money, but I lived in a normal house and drove a normal truck. Then I met Claire. Claire was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. She was a single mother working as a waitress at a diner I used to eat at every morning. She had a 10-year-old son named David. They were struggling. They lived in a tiny apartment, and Claire was always tired from working double shifts. I fell in love with her fast. I felt sorry for them, but I also just wanted to be the man who took care of them. I married Claire a year later. I adopted David. I gave him my last name. I bought them a big house. I paid for David to go to the best private schools. I treated that boy like he was my own flesh and blood. I loved them with every piece of my heart. A few years into our marriage, the world started getting crazy. People were scared of wars, sickness, and the economy crashing. Some rich people started asking me if I could build underground shelters for them. Not just little basements, but massive, luxury bunkers deep underground where they could survive for years if the world ended. I took the job. I designed a bunker system that was perfect. It had its own air cleaning system, water filters, solar battery backups, and enough space to feel like a real home. The business blew up. Suddenly, I wasn't just a local builder anymore. I was making tens of millions of dollars building these underground fortresses for billionaires, politicians, and celebrities. The money was pouring in faster than I could count it. That is when I saw Claire and David change. David was in his early 20s by then. He dropped out of college because he said he wanted to help run my business. But he didn't want to work. He just wanted to walk around the office in a suit that cost $5,000, acting like he was the boss. Claire changed too. She stopped looking at me with love. She only looked at me when she needed my credit card. She started hanging out with rich, snobby people. She threw parties at our house while I was away working in the dirt. I felt like a stranger in my own home. I felt like an ATM machine that breathed, but I kept my mouth shut. I told myself it was just a phase. I told myself that family is family, and you just have to love them through the hard times. I was a fool. I was blind. One day, David came to me with an idea. He said we needed to build a masterpiece bunker, a prototype that was better than anything else we had ever made. We bought a piece of land out in the middle of the desert, miles away from anyone. Nobody knew about this land except me, Claire, and David. We hired a crew from out of state to dig the hole and pour the concrete, and then we paid them extra to go away and never talk about it. I spent 6 months finishing the inside of that bunker myself. It was perfect. It was 50 feet deep. The walls were thick steel and concrete. The door weighed 2 tons. It had enough freeze-dried food and bottled water to last one person for 5 years. It had a bed, a bathroom, and a small gym. It was a masterpiece. On a hot Tuesday morning, Claire and David asked me to take them out to the desert to see the finished project. I was so proud. I drove us out there in my truck. We laughed and joked on the way. Claire held my hand. David was smiling. I felt like we were a real family again. When we got to the site, the entrance just looked like a heavy metal plate hidden under some rocks. We climbed down the 50-foot ladder in the main shaft. I opened the heavy blast door, and we stepped inside. I turned on the lights. They hummed to life, bright and warm. "It's amazing, Dad," David said. He walked around, looking at the food supplies and the air system. Claire went to the little kitchen area. She pulled a thermos out of her bag. "I brought coffee. she said, pouring 3 cups. Let's toast to the best builder in the world. I took the cup. I drank it. It tasted a little bitter, but I didn't think anything of it. I was just happy. I started explaining how the water filter worked, but suddenly my tongue fell heavy. My legs felt like they were made of jelly. I stumbled and dropped my cup. It shattered on the floor. I looked at Claire. She wasn't smiling anymore. She was just staring at me with cold, dead eyes. David stepped back, putting his hands in his pockets. Claire, I mumbled. The room was spinning. What did you? Sleep, Thomas, she said. Her voice was flat. No emotion at all. I fell to my knees. The darkness closed in on me, heavy and fast. The last thing I heard was the sound of my own son's footsteps walking toward the heavy blast door. Before we continue, kindly hit the subscribe button to catch more stories like this. And drop a comment to let me know where you are watching from. I'll love to hear. When I woke up, it was completely dark. The air was cold. My head throbbed with a pain so bad it made me want to throw up. I tried to stand, but my legs were weak. I crawled across the cold floor until my hand hit the smooth steel of the wall. I followed the wall until I found the light switch. I flipped it. The lights hummed and turned on. I was alone. I ran to the main blast door. I grabbed the heavy metal wheel and pulled with all my strength. It didn't move. I screamed and pulled again. Nothing. The locking mechanism on the inside had been removed. Someone had taken a blowtorch and melted the gears on my side of the door. I was locked in. Panic hit me like a train. I ran to the secondary escape hatch, a small tube that led up to the surface for emergencies. I climbed the short ladder and pushed against the top hatch. It wouldn't budge. I hit it with my fists until my knuckles bled. Then, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. I tapped on the metal with a wrench. It sounded thick and completely solid. They hadn't just locked the hatch. They had poured wet concrete over it. I was buried. I slid down the wall and sat on the floor, holding my head. I couldn't breathe. The walls felt like they were shrinking. I looked at the kitchen table. There was a single piece of paper sitting on it, next to the thermos Claire had brought. I walked over with shaking hands and picked it up. It was a letter written in Claire's neat handwriting. Thomas, if you were reading this, you woke up. I told David to give you a strong dose, but I guess you were tough. By the time you read this, we will be back in the city. Tomorrow, we are going to the police to report you missing. We will tell them you took your truck and drove off into the mountains because you were stressed from work. Your truck will be found near a cliff. They will search for a few weeks, but they won't find you. Nobody knows about this land. The deed is in a fake company's name. In 7 years, you will be declared legally dead. But honestly, we won't wait that long. I already have power of attorney. We are selling the business to a big corporation for $80 million. We are taking the money and leaving the country. Don't try to get out. You know how strong you built this place. The air will keep working. You have food and water for 5 years. But nobody is ever coming for you. I'm sorry, Thomas. You were a good man, but you were boring. You didn't know how to live. We do. Goodbye. I read the letter 3 times. My brain couldn't understand the words. My wife. My son. The people I work my fingers to the bone for. They didn't just rob me. They threw me away like a piece of garbage. They left me in a hole in the ground to go crazy and die alone, just so they could have my money. The first month, I lost my mind. I cried until I had no tears left. I screamed at the walls until my throat bled and I lost my voice. I threw heavy cans of food at the blast door. I paced the floor like a wild animal trapped in a cage. I lost track of days and nights. There was no sun to tell me when to wake up and when to sleep. The silence was so loud it made my ears ring. Sometimes I would talk to myself just to hear a voice. Sometimes I would talk to the empty chair and pretend Claire was sitting in it. I would ask her why. I would beg her to come back and open the door. But nobody came. By the 3rd month, the sadness was gone. It burned away completely. What replaced it was a dark, boiling anger. It was a kind of hate I didn't know a human being could feel. I stopped crying. I stopped screaming. I looked at myself in the small mirror in the bathroom. I had grown a thick beard. My eyes looked wild and hollow. I didn't look like Thomas the Builder anymore. I looked like a monster. And that is exactly what I needed to become. I realized something. They left me food for 5 years. They expected me to just sit down here, eat my freeze-dried meals, and wait to die of old age or sickness. They thought I was a passive, boring man who would just accept his fate. But they forgot one very important thing. They forgot that I was the man who built this box. I knew every wire, every pipe, every inch of steel in this place. If a man can build a prison, a man can break out of it. I started to work. I needed to keep my mind sharp and my body strong. I started working out in the small gym for 4 hours every single day. I lifted weights until my muscles felt like they were tearing. I did push-ups until my arms gave out. I ran in place for hours. I want to be hard. I want to be a weapon. Every time I lifted a weight, I pictured David's face. Every time I hit the punching bag, I pictured Claire's smile. Then, I focused on the door. The main blast door was too thick. 2 tons of solid steel. I couldn't cut through it. The escape hatch was blocked by solid concrete. But there was a third way out. The air ventilation shaft. The air shaft was an 8-inch pipe that went straight up 50 feet to the surface. It brought fresh air down and pushed bad air out. It was too small for a man to fit through. But it was not too small for a blast. I didn't have dynamite. I didn't have guns. But I had a water filtration system. The system used strong chemicals to purify the recycled water. I had bags of chlorine, ammonia, and other heavy industrial chemicals stored in the utility closet. I knew from my days working in demolition before I started building houses that if you mix the right chemicals under high pressure, you get a bomb. It took me 2.5 years to gather enough chemicals from the daily water cycles. 2.5 years of living in that box. I kept track of the time by scratching marks into the steel wall with a screw. 1,000 days. 1,000 days of silence. 1,000 days of eating dried beans and rice. 1,000 days of letting the hate keep me warm. I carefully extracted the chemicals and mixed them into empty heavy-duty plastic water jugs. I was making a liquid explosive. I took the metal pipes from the bed frame and sealed one end. I filled the pipes with the liquid explosive and sealed the other end, leaving just a tiny pinhole. I used the wires from the lighting system to create an electrical trigger. My plan was dangerous. If the explosion was too big, it would cave in the ceiling and crush me to death. If it was too small, it wouldn't break the concrete plug at the top of the air shaft, and I would suffocate from the smoke. It had to be perfect. On day 1095, exactly 3 years after they locked me in, I was ready. I took my homemade pipe bombs and shoved them as far up the air ventilation shaft as I could reach. I wired them to a car battery I pulled from the solar backup system. I put on thick work clothes, wrapped my head in a heavy blanket, and hid under the thick steel table in the kitchen area. I held the 2 wires in my hands. My heart was beating so fast I thought it would break my ribs. I closed my eyes. I didn't pray to God. I just saw the faces of the people who put me down here. "I'm coming home, Claire," I whispered. I touched the wires together. The explosion was the loudest thing I've ever heard in my life. It felt like the whole world ripped open. The floor shook violently. The lights shattered, plunging the bunker into total darkness. A wave of heat and dust slammed into me, throwing me against the wall, even under the table. The sound of tearing metal and crumbling rock echoed in the dark. Dust filled my lungs, making me choke. I waited in the dark for 10 minutes. The rumbling stopped. I couldn't hear the air system anymore. It was dead. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on. The beam cut through the thick gray dust filling the room. I walked over to the air shaft. The metal pipe had been blown completely open. A massive pile of dirt and broken concrete covered the floor. But when I looked up, my breath caught in my throat. 50 feet up, at the very top of the jagged, broken tunnel of dirt, I saw a tiny, beautiful thing. It was a star. I saw the night sky. I started to climb. The dirt was loose and kept sliding down, but I didn't care. I dug my fingers into the rough soil. I cut my hands on broken rocks. I climbed like a madman. I pulled myself up, foot by foot, fighting the earth that tried to keep me in my grave. Dirt fell into my eyes and mouth. I was bleeding, sweating, and crying all at the same time. When my hand finally reached the top and grabbed a handful of dry desert grass, I pulled myself out. I rolled onto the desert floor and lay on my back, gasping for fresh air. The night wind was cold, and it felt like magic on my skin. I looked up at the huge, open sky. I was free. I was alive. I stood up slowly. I looked down at the dark hole in the ground, the grave they dug for me. I looked at my hands. They were covered in blood and dirt. I was 50 miles from the nearest town. I had no money, no ID, and no water. But I had something much stronger. I started walking towards the highway. It would take me 2 days to walk there, but that was fine. I had all the time in the world now. Claire and David thought they were rich. They thought they were safe. They probably lived in a huge mansion now, driving nice cars, laughing about the stupid old man they buried in the desert. They didn't know that the man they buried died in that hole. The thing that climbed out was something else entirely. And it was coming to collect a debt that money couldn't pay. The desert at night is as cold as a freezer, but when the sun comes up, it turns into a giant oven. I walked for 2 days. I had no shoes. My clothes were torn into rags. The bottom of my feet blistered and bled until the sand turned red where I stepped. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The hate in my blood was like an engine keeping my legs moving. I didn't feel the thirst, even though my lips cracked and peeled. I just kept my eyes on the horizon, looking for a road. On the second evening, I saw a thin gray line in the distance. A highway. I dragged my body toward it. By the time I reached the black asphalt, I was half dead. I collapsed on the side of the road, the rough gravel biting into my cheek. An hour later, an old semi-truck rattled down the highway. The driver saw me lying there in the dirt and slammed on his brakes. The huge truck hissed and groaned to a stop. The driver was an old man with a thick beard and kind eyes. He ran out with a plastic jug of water. He didn't ask me my name. He didn't ask why I looked like a wild animal that had just crawled out of a grave. He just poured the water over my face and helped me into the cab of his truck. He gave me an old blanket and drove me 300 miles to a busy city in Arizona. He dropped me off behind a truck stop, handed me a $20 bill, and told me to stay out of trouble. I thanked him. It was the first time I had spoken to another human being in 3 years. My voice sounded like dry leaves scraping against concrete. I used the $20 to buy a cheap razor, a bar of soap, and a hot meal at a dirty diner. I went into the public bathroom at a gas station and locked the door. I looked in the mirror. I didn't recognize the man staring back at me. He looked dangerous. He looked empty. I turned on the hot water and washed 3 years of bunker dirt off my skin. I shaved the wild, crazy beard down to a clean face. I used a pair of cheap scissors to cut my tangled hair short. When I was done, I looked like a normal, tough man looking for work. I didn't look like Thomas, the millionaire builder. I looked like a ghost. I needed money. I couldn't go to a bank. I couldn't use my name. If Claire and David knew I was alive, they would take their $80 million and run to a country where I could never find them. I found a construction site on the edge of town. They were building a cheap apartment building. I walked up to the foreman and asked for a job under the table. Sweeping, carrying heavy wood, pouring cement. I told him I would work for half the normal pay if he paid me in cash at the end of every day. He looked at my thick arms and calloused hands and told me to grab a shovel. For 2 months, I worked in the blistering heat. I slept in an empty alley behind a dumpster. I didn't spend a single penny on anything except cheap bread, canned beans, and water. Every time my back ached or my hands cramped, I thought about my wife drinking expensive wine. I thought about my stepson laughing in a custom-made suit. The anger kept me warm at night. It kept my stomach full when I was starving. After 2 months, I had saved up $2,000 in dirty, crumpled bills. It was enough. I quit the job, went to a cheap clothing store, and bought a pair of dark jeans, a black work shirt, a dark jacket, and a good pair of black boots. Then, I walked to the public library. I sat down at a computer in the back corner. My hands shook a little as I typed my own name into the search bar. Thomas Builder missing. Hundreds of articles popped up. There was a picture of Claire, crying on the local news. She was holding a tissue to her eyes, talking about how her husband was under so much stress from work that he just drove away into the mountains and disappeared. The police had found my truck abandoned, near a steep cliff, exactly like she wrote in her letter. They dragged a nearby lake. They searched the woods with dogs. They never found a body. After a year, the search was called off. Then I typed in Claire's name. My heart started beating so fast I could hear it in my ears. She was everywhere. There were pictures of her attending fancy charity galas, wearing diamond necklaces that cost more than most people make in a lifetime. There were articles about her selling my company to a massive real estate group for $85 million. And there was David. He was posing next to a bright red sports car. The article called him a young visionary. They were living in a massive, gated mansion in a rich neighborhood in Southern California. They were kings and queens. They built their castle on my bones. I wrote down the address of the mansion. I deleted the search history, stood up, and walked out of the library. I took a long bus ride to California. When I got to their city, it smelled like ocean salt and expensive perfume. The streets were perfectly clean. The cars were all shiny and new. I bought a cheap prepaid cell phone, a pair of heavy wire cutters, black gloves, a small crowbar, and a voice recorder. I rented a cheap motel room on the bad side of town and started planning. I didn't want to just walk up to their front door and kill them. A bullet is too fast. A bullet doesn't give you time to think about what you did. I wanted them to feel the exact same terror I felt when the lights went out in that bunker. I wanted them to feel trapped. I wanted them to know that their money couldn't save them. I wanted to break their minds before I broke their lives. I spent a week watching their house. It wasn't just a house. It was a fortress. It had high stone walls, wrought iron gates, and security cameras pointing in every direction. But they forgot something very important. I was the man who used to build fortresses for billionaires. I knew exactly how these security systems worked. I knew the blind spots. I knew that the cameras on the east wall swept back and forth every 30 seconds. I knew that if you climbed the big oak tree just outside the wall, you can drop into the garden right where the cameras can't see you. On a Tuesday night, exactly 1 month after I crawled out of the ground, I made my first move. It was past midnight. The street was quiet. I wore my black clothes and my gloves. I climbed the oak tree, waited for the camera to sweep away, and dropped silently into the soft grass of their garden. I moved through the shadows like a stray dog. I went to the back door. It was a heavy glass door with an electronic keypad lock. I pulled a small jammer device I bought from a pawn shop out of my pocket and held it near the lock. It scrambled the magnetic signal just long enough for me to pry the door open with a thin piece of metal. I stepped inside my wife's new house. It was huge. Everything was white and gold. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Expensive paintings covered the walls. It made me sick. I walked silently up the wide, carpeted stairs. I knew exactly where the master bedroom was. I opened the door. Claire was asleep in a massive bed. She looked so peaceful. Her chest moved up and down slowly. I stood over her for 10 full minutes. My hands balled into fists. It would have been so easy to just put a pillow over her face and end it right there. But I forced myself to step back. The game was just starting. Before I left the bunker, I had filled a small plastic bag with the thick, gray dirt from the floor. The dirt of my grave. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a handful of the dirt, and sprinkled it on the pristine white pillow. My hands balled into fists. It would have been so easy to just put a pillow over her face and end it right there. But I forced myself to step back. The game was just starting. Before I left the bunker, I had filled a small plastic bag with the thick, gray dirt from the floor. The dirt of my grave. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a handful of the dirt, and sprinkled it on the pristine white pillow right next to Claire's face. Then, I walked down the hall to David's room. He was snoring, his mouth hanging open. He had a glass of expensive whiskey sitting on his nightstand. I took the glass, poured the whiskey onto his expensive rug, and set the empty glass down upside down. I placed a single, dirty, rusted screw that I had pulled from the bunker's blast door right on top of the glass. I left the house without making a sound. The next day, I sat in a park across the street from their gated community, looking through a pair of cheap binoculars. By 10 in the morning, I saw a private security van pull up to their gate. Claire and David were scared. I could imagine the screaming inside the house. Someone had bypassed their $1 million security system just to leave dirt on a pillow and a rusty screw on a glass. It didn't make sense to them. The security guards walked around the property, pointing at the cameras, scratching their heads. They couldn't find a single footprint. I was a ghost. I waited 2 days. Let the paranoia sink in. Let them jump at every shadow. Let them lose sleep. On Thursday night, it started to rain. A heavy, dark storm rolled in from the ocean. Thunder shook the windows of the city. It was the perfect night to end this. I went back over the wall. The rain washed away any sound I made. This time, I didn't go straight into the house. I went to the main power box attached to the side of the garage. I used my heavy wire cutters to smash the lock. I reached inside and completely destroyed the main breaker panel. The entire mansion went pitch black instantly. I slipped through the back door again. The house was dead quiet, except for the sound of the rain hitting the roof. Upstairs, I heard a door open. "David." Claire's voice echoed in the dark. She sounded terrified. "David, the power is out. The backup generator didn't turn on." Of course it didn't. I had poured sugar into the generator's gas tank an hour ago. "I'm coming, Mom. Stay in your room," David yelled back. I heard his heavy footsteps running down the hall. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, completely hidden in the shadows. I watched David come to the top of the landing, holding a heavy brass lamp like a weapon. He had his cell phone in his other hand, using the weak flashlight to look around. "Who's there?" David screamed. "I have a gun. The police are on their way." He was lying. I had bought a cell phone jammer and placed it in the bushes outside. They had zero signal. No calls were going in or out. I didn't answer him. I just took one step onto the wooden stairs. The floorboard creaked loudly. David jumped back. "Mom, get in the panic room. Now." I smiled in the dark. That was exactly what I wanted. When you build these giant mansions for paranoid rich people, you always include a panic room. A small room with reinforced steel walls, a heavy locking door, and its own air supply. Sound familiar? It's just a smaller version of an underground bunker. It's a box. I heard Claire running down the hall. I heard the heavy mechanical click of the panic room door opening. It was located at the end of the second-floor hallway. David ran in after her, and the heavy steel door slammed shut. I heard the electronic deadbolts lock into place. They thought they were safe. They thought they had outsmarted the intruder. They locked themselves in a steel box to hide from the monster. They didn't realize the monster had the keys. I walked slowly up the stairs. I didn't hide my footsteps anymore. I wanted them to hear my heavy boots hitting the wood. Thump, thump, thump. I walked down the hall and stopped right in front of the panic room door. I knew the exact model of this door. I helped design the mechanism years ago. The people inside can lock it, but there is always a master override panel hidden behind the drywall outside the room, in case the owners have a medical emergency inside and rescue teams need to cut their way in. I took my crowbar and smashed it into the drywall right next to the door frame. I ripped chunks of white plaster away until I saw the gray metal box of the override panel. I smashed the cover off. Wires spilled out. I grabbed the main control wires, crossed them, and sent a surge through the system. The electronic deadbolts hissed. They didn't unlock. Instead, the system went into total lockdown mode. The door sealed itself permanently. The keypad on the inside would be completely dead. They couldn't open it if they tried. They were trapped. I pushed a button on the panel that turned on the two-way intercom system. "Hello, Claire," I said into the microphone. My voice was low, rough, and perfectly calm. For a long time, there was only silence from the speaker. Then, I heard a sound that was pure, raw terror. It was a gasp, so sharp it sounded like she was choking. "No," Claire whispered. The intercom picked up her shaking voice. "No, no, no. It's impossible. You're dead. Dead men don't leave dirt on pillows," I said. "Dead men don't cross wires." "Dad." David's voice cracked. He sounded like a little boy crying in the dark. "Dad, is that you?" "Don't call me that," I snapped, my anger finally leaking into my voice. "You lost the right to use that word when you locked a 2-ton steel door and left me to eat dried rice in a hole for 3 years. Thomas, please." Claire started sobbing. Loud, ugly cries. Please, we were crazy. We made a mistake. We thought you were unhappy. We didn't mean to hurt you. Let us out. We will give you the money. We will give you everything." "I don't want the money," I said, leaning my head against the cold steel of the door. "I don't want the house. I came here to give you a gift. I came here to give you exactly what you gave me." "What do you mean?" David screamed, pounding his fists against the inside of the door. It sounded like a mouse tapping on a bank vault. "Open the door. You can't do this. The air supply in that panic room is good for exactly 48 hours, I said calmly. After that, it starts getting thin. But don't worry. I'm not a monster like you. I'm not going to leave you to die. I pulled the small digital voice recorder out of my pocket. I held it up to the intercom speaker. "I want you to tell me exactly what you did on that Tuesday morning in the desert," I said. "I want you to tell me how you poisoned my coffee. I want you to tell me how you locked the door and poured the concrete. If you don't tell me every single detail right now, I will walk out of this house, and I will never, ever come back. You will sit in that dark box until the air turns into poison. You have 10 seconds to start talking." "Okay, okay," Claire screamed. "We did it. I put the sleeping pills in the thermos. I planned it. David just helped me carry you. We locked the hatch. We poured the cement. We did it for the business. Please, Thomas. We confess. We did it." "Yeah, it was her idea," David yelled, instantly betraying his own mother to save his skin. "She made me do it, Dad. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." They cried and screamed, throwing each other under the bus, confessing to attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy. The voice recorder captured every single word perfectly. I pressed stop on the recorder. "Thank you," I said into the intercom. "Are you going to open the door now?" Claire begged. "Thomas, are you there?" "I told you I wouldn't leave you to die," I said. "I'm going to walk out of this house. I'm going to take this little voice recorder, and I'm going to drop it in the mailbox of the local police station. In about 2 hours, a SWAT team is going to break down your front door. They're going to cut you out of that box." "Thomas, wait. If you give that to the police, we'll go to prison for the rest of our lives." David screamed. "I know," I said. I smiled, though there was nobody there to see it. "Enjoy the box, David. You built a nice one for me. Now you get to live in one with metal bars for the next 50 years. Thomas, please," Claire wailed, her fists beating uselessly against the thick steel. I stepped back from the door. I didn't say another word. I turned around and walked down the dark hallway. Their screams and cries followed me down the stairs, echoing through the massive, empty mansion. It was the sweetest song I had ever heard. I walked out the back door and stepped out into the pouring rain. I let the cold water wash over my face. The heavy weight that had been sitting on my chest for 3 years finally lifted. The ghost was gone. The monster was gone. I walked down the quiet, wet streets of the city. I had a long life ahead of me, and I was going to live every single minute of it under the open sky. Before we continue, kindly hit the subscribe button to catch more stories like this, and drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from. I'll love to hear.